You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 488 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with the last episode, we started to look at the collapse of Grant's peripheral strategy in Virginia in the spring of 1864. We talked about Crook's expedition out in western Virginia and the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain, which took place on May 9th.
By the end of the last episode, George Crook, despite winning a victory over the Confederates at Cloyd's Mountain, had decided to call it quits and head back to West Virginia. On May 14th, his column reached the town of Union, just across the border in West Virginia. The next day, Averill's Federal horsemen rode into town, and for the first time, Crook learned the full story of how the cavalry had fared.
William Averill had left Charleston, West Virginia late on May 2nd and reached Logan Courthouse 3 days later. From that point, his raid began in earnest, toiling, quote, up pathless mountains and across tortuous streams, end quote, until he reached Jeffersonville on May 8th. There he met the first enemy opposition and also received reports of 4,500 Confederates at Saltville, whose extensive salt works were his primary target.
Averill took the reports at face value. However, if he'd scouted more aggressively, he'd have discovered that only 1,300 rebels were at Saltville.
In any case, turning away from Saltville, Averill headed next for the lead mines at Wytheville, only to find them guarded by 4,500 Confederates, commanded by Brigadier Generals William Grumble Jones and John Hunt Morgan, who decided that the best defense was a good offense. Accordingly, they struck out at the Yankees and, in the ensuing 4-hour fight, repeatedly forced Averill to backpedal. John Hunt Morgan, in a letter to his wife, said, quote, if we had 2 more hours of daylight, we could have captured the whole force. Morgan said the Confederates shoved the Yankees back from position to position as, quote, our boys gave them no time to form.
After finally breaking contact with their tormentors, Averill's horsemen rode eastward, following the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. They arrived at Dublin Depot on May 11th and found it smoldering, thanks to the visit of Crook's Federals after their victory at Cloyd's Mountain.
Farther along the railroad, at Christiansburg, Averill finally tore up a few miles of track and burned some buildings, and communicated with Crook, who was then just a few miles away at Blacksburg. Crook sent instructions for Averill to proceed along the railroad to Lynchburg, destroying the tracks as he went. But Averill did nothing of the sort. Instead, he also decided to call it quits, and he turned north to link up with Crook at Union.
From Union, Crook and Averill's combined forces continued on to Meadow Bluff, where the weary Federal troops rested and replenished their supplies, while George Crook and William Averill composed their after-action reports.
What exactly had they accomplished? Well, Averill, of course, had achieved little, and so his report focused on things like the courage and fortitude of his men, the physical obstacles they overcame, and the Confederates' failure to destroy his column.
Crook had done more, though he failed to toot his own horn in his official report. However, Rutherford B. Hayes, in a letter to his uncle, gushed about the column's accomplishments, writing, quote, "Our raid has been in all respects successful. We destroyed the famous Dublin Bridge and 18 miles of railroad and many depots and stores, captured 10 pieces of artillery, 300 prisoners, and killed and wounded about 500, besides utterly routing Jenkins' army in the bloody battle of Cloyd's Mountain."
In Crook's report, he refrained from criticizing his cavalry counterpart, but Hayes was less charitable. He told his uncle, "I see the papers call this Averill's Raid. Very funny. The cavalry part of it was a total failure. General Averill only got to the railroad at points where we had first got in. He was driven back at Saltville and Wytheville."
But Hayes failed to recognize that, in a larger sense, both raids had failed. That's because Ulysses S. Grant had wanted them to tie down the Confederates and prevent the release of troops from southwest Virginia to reinforce Robert E. Lee. But by May 11th, 1 week after the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan, the threats posed by Crook and Averill's columns had, for all practical purposes, evaporated.
In Averill's case, this result was disappointing but understandable. His modest force of cavalry wasn't large enough to do much on its own, and he'd suffered bad luck and reversals from the time he'd set out. But Crook calling it quits and returning to West Virginia was another matter entirely. Why hadn't he kept up the pressure on the Confederates after he'd secured one of the most complete little victories of the war at Cloyd's Mountain?
Crook's report addressed that question by saying that at Dublin Depot, quote, "I saw dispatches from Richmond stating that General Grant had been repulsed and was retreating."
Well, George Crook took these erroneous reports at face value, which meant that he expected Confederate troops detached from Lee's victorious army to roll down the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad and reinforce the rebel force he, Crook, was facing in southwestern Virginia.
On a side note, that Crook so readily accepted the news of Lee's victory over Grant as gospel truth is eloquent testimony to the faith of Federals everywhere in Robert E. Lee's ability to thrash all comers.
Be that as it may, Crook's withdrawal back to West Virginia, in combination with events unfolding in the Shenandoah Valley, would have a significant impact on the contest between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia.
While Crook and Averill raided against the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, Major General Franz Sigel marched up the Macadamized Valley Turnpike with force nearly 9,000 strong.
Sigel, the commander of the Department of West Virginia, was, due solely to his own machinations, making the main offensive in his department. This was a major development since, until recently, Ulysses S. Grant hadn't contemplated an advance up the Shenandoah Valley at all.
The valley had seen a lot of fighting since the beginning of the war. Evidence of it lay all along the turnpike as Sigel's force made an initial march from Martinsburg, West Virginia, to an assembly point at Cedar Creek near Strasburg. One of Sigel's staff officers noted that, quote, "graves and dead animals in all stages of decomposition marked the way."
Men and beasts had fallen in the struggle for possession of the valley's strategic geography, which offered the Confederates a sheltered avenue of invasion into the north, for the region's rich farmland, dubbed the breadbasket of the Confederacy, and for the foundries, storehouses, and railroad facilities at Stanton, where the harvest of the valley was loaded aboard the trains of the Virginia Central Railroad and shipped east to feed Richmond and Lee's army.
All of that was at risk if Sigel's offensive succeeded, and for that reason, Confederate Commander Major General John C. Breckinridge, as we talked about last time, left his headquarters at Dublin Depot in southwest Virginia and took his best troops north to confront the Yankees threatening the valley.
Sigel left Cedar Creek on May 11th. At Woodstock, the next village up the road, he learned from captured dispatches that Breckinridge, with between 4,000 and 4,500 men, was on his way north to confront him. In the meantime, Sigel's column faced only 1,400 rebel cavalry led by Brigadier General John D. Imboden, who was desperate enough to call out the local home guard.
But Sigel, unsure of the enemy's dispositions, plagued by guerrilla attacks, and bedeviled by the same heavy rains that had stalled Grant's offensive at Spotsylvania, lingered at Woodstock until May 14th.
Even then, Sigel only launched a reconnaissance in force, which continued up the Valley Turnpike another 20 miles to the village of Newmarket. The reconnaissance was led by Colonel August Moore, who had serious reservations about the assignment. For one thing, Sigel had ordered him to not take the troops of his own brigade, but instead take 3 unfamiliar infantry regiments, 1,000 cavalry, and a battery of artillery.
Another reason Moore was uneasy was the entire force numbered 2,350 men, too many to withdraw easily if the Confederates materialized in strength, but not nearly enough to fight a pitched battle with any hope of success.
However, Moore lucked out. He encountered nothing but Imboden's cavalry, shoved the rebel horsemen back during the course of the day, and by evening he had reached Newmarket. Early the next morning, Moore sent out patrols to see what had become of Imboden. Around 7 a.m., a cavalry detachment returned with word that the rebel horsemen were about 4 miles south of Newmarket and had been joined by Breckinridge's Confederate infantry. It wasn't long before the Federals saw enemy horsemen buzzing about on the hills to the south, and Moore set to work preparing to make a defensive stand at Newmarket.
Sigel, encouraged by reports Moore had sent back the previous day, had already ordered the rest of his force forward. Sigel left Woodstock at 5 o'clock on the morning of May 15th, preceded by about 1,000 cavalry under Brigadier General Julius Stahill.
When Stahill, who outranked Moore, reached Newmarket, he assumed command. When a soft rain began to fall, Stahill and the 3,350 Federals at Newmarket tried to stay dry, watched for the rebels, and waited for Sigel to arrive.
Just south of the Federal line lay Shirley's Hill, a grassy elevation that rose about 150 feet above the surrounding countryside. Breckinridge and Imboden stood on its summit, discussing how to eject the Yankees from Newmarket.
Breckinridge had arrived around 3 a.m. In addition to the 735 rebel cavalrymen led by Imboden, Breckinridge had 2 infantry brigades under John Eccles and Gabriel Wharton that had accompanied him from southwest Virginia. These had a combined strength of a little over 3,000 men. The force at Breckinridge's disposal also included 500 local home guardsmen, a tiny company of engineer troops, 330 additional cavalry, 18 artillery pieces, and 227 cadets from the Virginia Military Institute. The cadets ranged in age from 15 to 18, and Breckinridge, who had been offered their service by the school's superintendent, only reluctantly agreed, since he had no wish to put these boys into harm's way. In any case, Breckinridge, all told, had just over 5,330 men with which to stop Sigel's force of almost 9,000.
Breckinridge had expected to fight a defensive battle, but a quick survey of the ground led him to change his mind. He saw that two streams, the North Fork of the Shenandoah River and Smith's Creek, would prevent his flanks from being turned, so there was the possibility that even with a smaller force, Breckinridge could launch a successful assault.
Imboden recalled that within 5 minutes, Breckinridge had surveyed the ground and made his decision, declaring, "We can attack and whip them here, and I'll do it." Breckinridge reached that decision around 10 a.m., and an hour later he had the Confederate infantry marching about on Shirley's Hill, in and out of sight of the enemy, as one of his subordinates explained, quote, "playing the old strategic trick of countermarching his men, with the view of multiplying their numbers in the eyes of the enemy."
The trick worked. Reports flowed back to Sigel that the rebel force numbered 10, 20, 15, 20,000 strong. Though Franz Sigel had sense enough to doubt the accuracy of the report, they still served to create a sense of uncertainty and danger.
Sigel had initially contemplated having Stahill fall back upon the main body and giving battle at Mount Jackson, a village 7 miles north of Newmarket. But with reports that the Confederate skirmishers were aggressively pressuring Stahill's line at Newmarket, Sigel changed his mind and declared, "We may as well fight them today as any day. We will advance."
Having decided, for their own reasons, to battle it out at Newmarket, Sigel and Breckinridge now assembled their full strength upon the fields and on hills and in the valleys north of town.
By 2 o'clock that afternoon, all was ready. Sigel had arrived and deployed on Bushong's Hill, about a mile north of Newmarket. Although the position was a strong one, Sigel erred by disposing his troops in 2 lines that couldn't support one another, one on the hill itself, the second about 1,000 yards in front. Worse, he didn't have his whole force present, since some units were still carrying out the outdated orders to concentrate at Mount Jackson.
In contrast to Sigel's flawed dispositions, Breckinridge placed his own infantry in a compact mass between the Shenandoah River and the Valley Turnpike, with most of his artillery astride the road and Imboden's cavalry covering the ground between the turnpike and Smith's Creek.
Imboden realized that the Federal cavalry was to his front, partially concealed in woods. He got permission from Breckinridge to send a battery of guns east of Smith's Creek to take the Yankees under fire from their left flank. Meanwhile, Breckinridge pressed ahead with Eccles and Wharton's brigades and personally supervised the handling of the Confederate artillery, advancing the guns from one hill to another so as to keep the enemy under a steady barrage of shells.
The Confederate infantry hit the first Federal line, overlapping it on both flanks, and soon had these Yankees hustling back toward Bushong's Hill. An Ohio soldier noted his regiment fired just 1 volley, then withdrew, declaring sarcastically that, quote, "it was Sigel's way of fighting."
As the Federals who had manned Sigel's first line fell back toward the hill, the Confederate infantry pursued them closely. Breckinridge saw that the strongest part of the enemy line on Bushong's Hill was at the summit, close to the Shenandoah River, so he had the bulk of his forces head in that direction and led them personally. The balance of his force kept up the pressure along the rest of Sigel's line, or tried to. The rapidity of the rebel advance, the vagaries of the terrain, and the smoke of battle now combined to create a gap in the Confederate line, and Stahill's Union cavalry was opposite the gap, having been driven from its first position by Imboden's artillery, but redeployed here on good ground and peppering the rebels with carbine fire.
There was no doubt the Federals would see the gap in the rebel line and seek to exploit it as quickly as they could. With the sinking feeling, Breckinridge realized that what had been shaping up to be a smashing Confederate triumph seemed about to fall apart.
Breckinridge reviewed his options. The obvious solution was to shorten his lines to eliminate the gap, but that would be difficult to pull off since his entire line was now under heavy enemy fire, and attempting such a movement would likely cause such confusion among the Confederate units that it might tip the battle in favor of the Federals.
Then a staff officer spoke. "General, why don't you put the cadets in line? They will fight as well as our men."
Breckinridge replied, "No, Charlie, this will not do. They are only children, and I cannot expose them to such a fire."
The officer insisted, "General, it is too late. The Federals are right on us. If the cadets are ordered up, we can close the gap in our center."
Everyone who was close enough to hear the exchange could see that Breckinridge's face was wet with tears as he said, "Put the boys in, and may God forgive me for the order."
Incoming transmission.
Hello, my name is Matt.
And I'm McKinley. We are the father-son team that brings you History Dispatches.
History Dispatches is a short daily history show where we talk about topics from all over the world and all throughout history. We talk about people, places, events, and even objects.
While anything is fair game, we have a soft spot for the weird, the wacky, and the obscure things you may have never even heard of.
Do you have any examples?
How about Wojtek, the bear who rose to the rank of corporal in the Polish army? Or the Great Emu War? Or how about the biggest treasure take in the history of piracy?
That sounds cool, but do you have a story about the head of Oliver Cromwell? Or one about the ancient library of Alexandria? And a story about the first woman to climb Mount Everest would be cool.
Well, we got those as well. Every weekday there's something new and fun.
Sweet. So how do I get this trove of goodness?
All you have to do is go to historydispatches.com or just look for History Dispatches in your favorite podcast app.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places. Nowhere as important to the world as China. But these days, few journalists are able to get the inside story. That's because China has shut the door to much of the media.
Authorities have far more efficient tools to control the press, and they're far less reluctant to use them.
I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. On Face Off, the U.S. versus China, we're trying to break through. We'll talk about Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, TikTok, and even Hollywood. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.
The staff officer went to the cadets who had been following behind the Confederate infantry and led them toward the gap in the rebel line. The cadets had been under fire briefly during the morning skirmishing, and a handful had been wounded, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened when they marched up and joined the main battle line.
Musket and cannon fire tore into their ranks. 3 cadets went down immediately, 2 of them killed outright, the third writhing on the grass in agony until his heart stopped beating.
50 yards further on, another cadet took a bullet full in the chest and collapsed. He had just enough time to tear open his tailored gray uniform jacket and see the wound before he died.
In the morning engagement, the cadets' formation had been shaky when they first came under fire, but now it was not. They stayed in good order, stood the punishment, and closed up their ranks like veterans when their classmates fell dead or wounded. They reached a fence just beyond an orchard, and in doing so, sealed the gap in Breckinridge's line.
Men on both sides realized that the battle hung in the balance. One Confederate recalled, quote, The position was very critical, and for a time it seemed doubtful as to which army would be the first to give way.
Sigel was already almost beside himself with excitement, wrote a staff officer, quote, and rode here and there with Stayhill and Moore, all jabbering in German. In his excitement, he seemed to forget his English entirely, and the purely American portion of his staff were totally useless to him.
Sigel now decided that dramatic action was needed to tilt the scales toward a federal victory. He therefore ordered a charge with 3 regiments.
William C. Davis, in his study of the Battle of Newmarket, estimates these 3 federal regiments contained about 1,700 soldiers, while the Confederates had between 2,600 and 2,800 men immediately on hand to stop them. Davis's assessment of Sigel is devastating but deserved. Quote, having begun his march with an army that outnumbered all of Breckinridge's forces almost 2-1, he had now mismanaged and maneuvered himself into a position where he was ordering an attack that outnumbered him by more than 3-2. The verdict is clear. Franz Sigel was not just incompetent, he was a fool.
Needless to say, the federal charge failed, and badly enough to disrupt Sigel's entire line and set the stage for the collapse of the Union position.
The Confederates were quick to take advantage of the shift in fortunes. As Federal artillery pieces began to pull out, the rebels pressed forward, focusing on shooting down the battery horses and capturing the enemy guns. The VMI cadets participated in this final Confederate attack, charged a Union battery, and captured one of its 12-pounder Napoleons. Other rebels captured 4 more guns, which were left on the battlefield as Sigel ordered a general retreat.
The retreat, at least, went off without a hitch, other than the captured guns, that is. The Yankees were able to get away because Imboden's rebel horsemen failed to seize and destroy the single bridge over which Sigel's troops had to use to get over the rain-swollen Shenandoah River.
The Federals started crossing that bridge at 4:30 that afternoon, barely 2.5 hours after the main phase of the battle had begun. They didn't stop their retreat until they reached Strasburg, 1 day and 32 miles later. There, Sigel received word that Averill and Crook had been successful in their raids against the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. And so a staff officer wisecracked, "We are doing a good business in this department. Averill is tearing up the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, while Sigel is tearing down the Valley Turnpike." Well, that quip about his retreat down the turnpike was widely repeated, much to Sigel's dismay.
The brief Newmarket campaign cost the Federals 96 killed, 520 wounded, and 225 missing, for a total of 841 men, or 14% of the force engaged, although it's worth noting in that regard that nearly a third of Sigel's total force didn't even get into action, thanks largely to his mismanagement.
As is often the case, Confederate casualties are hard to pin down with any certainty, but it's thought they suffered at least 43 killed, 474 wounded, and 3 missing, for a total of 531 or more. Among the dead were 10 VMI cadets. Another 45 cadets were wounded, meaning about 25% of them became casualties. It was said that for the rest of his life, John C. Breckinridge couldn't think of them without weeping.
For the Federals, now came the ultimate consequence for the failure of Averill and Crook to vigorously pursue a continuation of their raids against the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad, because a day before the Battle of Newmarket, Robert E. Lee had wired Breckinridge saying, "If you can drive back the different expeditions threatening the valley, it would be very desirable for you to join me with your whole force."
On the morning of the battle, Breckinridge had received word that Averill and Crook were falling back to West Virginia. So, once he had dealt with Sigel, there was nothing now stopping him from complying with Lee's request. And so, on May 19th, at Stanton, Breckinridge put the brigades of Eccles and Wharton on trains that headed down the Virginia Central Railroad, taking 2,500 priceless reinforcements to the Army of Northern Virginia.
Far to the east in Virginia, on May 15th, the same day the Battle of New Market was fought, a soldier in the 21st North Carolina wrote to his wife, quote, "The Yankees are pouring in like flies. We passed through Richmond day before yesterday, and they are in the greatest excitement in Richmond I ever seed in my life. They are scared nearly to death. The Yankees are doing a heap of mischief wherever they go."
That soldier scrawled the letter to his wife while he was at Drury's Bluff, a Confederate defensive bastion on the James River below Richmond. The excitement he described stemmed from two sources: Ben Butler's Federal Army of the James, which had landed at Bermuda Hundred and was now threatening both Richmond and the rail hub of Petersburg, and a strong Union cavalry raid, 10,000 troopers strong, led by Phil Sheridan, which had come within a few miles of the rebel capital, beaten the Confederate cavalry in a pitched battle at Yellow Tavern, and in the process slain one of the rebellion's greatest heroes. With the next show, we'll talk about the dual threats posed by Butler's expedition and Sheridan's raid, and the death of Jeb Stuart.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Valley Thunder, The Battle of New Market and the Opening of the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, 1864, by Charles R. Knight.
The Battle of New Market, for its modest size, has received an abundance of coverage in the literature of the Civil War, mostly due to the participation of the VMI cadets in the fighting. There are any number of magazine articles and books, although for 3 decades, William Davis, who we mentioned in the episode, was author of the best book-length treatment. But then came Charles Knight's Valley Thunder, published in 2010, and since then, it has been the gold standard as far as telling the tale of the Battle of New Market. So, there you go.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Stephen S. and James W. did this past week. A big thank you to them, and thanks also to Steve J. for his donation.
Yep. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. We hope you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.